Thousands of demonstrators are angry with COVID lockdowns, many of them calling for democracy and political freedoms and an end to President Xi Jinping's regime. Police have responded to the unrest with brutality, chaotic scenes of protesters being dragged, shoved, and beaten.
Protests are rare in China. However, over the last few weeks, people have taken to the streets to protest the zero COVID policies that take place in China. And of course, those policies mean that even with the vaccines available, certain parts of the country will shut down if there is an outbreak and people have to quarantine. And that has led to some unintended consequences, to say the least, including unnecessary deaths in one apartment fire, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. But the protests are, again, mostly about the country's zero COVID policy, which means constant lockdowns and quarantines. The 1.4 billion plus residents of China remain at the mercy of the stringent policy. It's designed to stamp out infections by relying on snap lockdowns of apartment buildings and sometimes whole cities or regions, as well as forcing lengthy quarantines and a litany of tests on residents. Now, this obviously leads to economic issues for people living in China, and due to the fact that we're all interconnected economically speaking, it's causing supply chain issues for the rest of the world. But I think it's also worth discussing what happened during this deadly fire in Urumqi, where 10 people died, and many are blaming these deaths on the COVID lockdowns and how it actually hindered any progress for firefighters to fight the fire. So without further ado, let's take a quick look at this next video.
10 people were killed and 9 injured in a fire at an apartment building. Most parts of Xinjiang have been under lockdown for more than 100 days. The deadly fire sparked nationwide outrage because widely circulated videos, which have now been censored in China, show that COVID lockdown measures very likely delayed firefighters from getting to the scene. State media claims that people in the compound were allowed to leave the building. However, videos show fire trucks unable to get close to the scene because the compound entrance was partially blocked. The video shows it's blocked with fences, tents, and metal barriers that are normally used as part of COVID measures. The video shows smoke and flames coming from a high floor of the building, but the water failing to actually reach the fire. What adds to the tragedy is that those who died in the fire likely spent their last 3 months largely confined to that building, if not entirely.
So that fire and the number of people who died as a result of that fire certainly fired people up and they took to the streets. One other thing that I'll mention before going to you, Cenk, is that, I mean, think about what's currently taking place on the world stage with the World Cup. And you see all of these world-class athletes standing side by side among one another without masks. And I'm sure that some people in China see that and think to themselves, well, I'm basically imprisoned in my own apartment right now. I'm not able to go outside, but look what's happening with the World Cup. Look what's happening with these athletes. And they're frustrated, and I totally understand why they would be.
Yeah, if you have the wrong system, you're gonna get the wrong results. It happens every time. So I want to take a broader look at it to give you a sense of the context here. So in the case of COVID, Sweden had the wrong system, so did Florida. Don't worry about it, hopefully things will work out. Well, no, that was the wrong strategy, and I know what they were thinking. They had absurd ideas about herd immunity and let's get through it quicker, et cetera. And what wound up happening is a death per capita rate that was significantly higher in places like Sweden and red states in America. So, but China had the wrong policy in the opposite direction, where they said, and they were nearly taunting the rest of the world, even though it came from Wuhan. Originally, and they were like, oh yeah, we're so authoritarian, we lock everything down, and we lock it down forever, and our people are so obedient, they just listen to us, unlike you unruly Americans. And the reality is Sweden and the red states were wrong, but so was China. And it's now an open argument as to which one was more wrong. The correct answer is to be measured and thoughtful and figure out the strategy that causes the least amount of damage. And you have to take into account every factor, not just COVID, but also how do people react when they're isolated for too long. And by the way, we had a crime outbreak here right after COVID. Was that slightly related? Studies haven't determined that yet, but there is some argument to be made there. So there's a lot, and by the way, learning for kids in school, a huge part of this as well. So China is wrong about that. We were partially wrong about that for some period of time here in America. So, and look, this is also in cases that have nothing to do with COVID. I remember when everybody was excited about Japan and they had bought Rockefeller Center. This is all the way back in the early 90s, and that's it, Japan has a better system than us. And I was like, no, it's top down. It allows for almost no creativity. It cannot take off, and it didn't. The Soviet Union, totally wrong incentives, wrong results. So this comes all the way back to the issue of authoritarian government of China. In the long run, it is the wrong system. It is untenable. And whether it's COVID or something else, eventually people will rise up, especially as China becomes more heavily concentrated in the middle class. Middle classes usually rise up quicker, and so that's what China is dealing with now, and they should. That's a good, healthy response to a government that is too oppressive.
And even with the so-called zero COVID policy, right now, the number of COVID cases in China is the highest it's ever been, right? And look, for me, I don't know why it's so difficult for people to understand this, okay? So taking those who have, immunity issues, other health concerns where the vaccine isn't as effective and won't protect them from hospitalization or potentially dying from COVID. For everyone else, once the vaccine's available, once you're able to get vaccinated, once you're able to get boosted, is there some possibility that you still could contract COVID and get sick? Yes, but what's the likelihood of getting hospitalized? What's the likelihood of dying from COVID? People are gonna get sick, either from COVID or from other illnesses. You can't prevent that from happening. You can't shut down society completely to stop that from happening, you know?
And it was hubris on the part of the Chinese government to think that they could. What, you have a culture that you think is so obedient that they will listen to any command, no matter how unreasonable? Well, you were wrong about that. At the end, human beings are gonna be human beings. And also, there's a little bit of a factor that is not often discussed here, which is that the Chinese were not able to replicate vaccines that match the efficacy of the ones in the West. And they caught feelings over that, the government did and the leadership did. And so China is not very highly vaccinated. And so they de-emphasize vaccines, which are actually the correct answer. And they emphasize lockdowns, which in the long run, as you see here, I mean, Jesus, we're 3 years in here, right? The rest of the world is out and about, and they're all still locked up. That is clearly not the right answer in the long run, and so there's massive mistakes.
That's a really interesting and important piece of context. Like I didn't realize they had been de-emphasizing vaccinations,
especially Western ones. Yes.
Oh my God, especially the Western vaccines?
Of course, because they want to take pride in a Chinese vaccine. Oh, we don't want that.
We're not winning with our world leaders.
No,
okay?
We're not.
And this is not just a commentary on China. We're just not winning with world leaders right now. Okay, just failure upon failure. I just want to also note that there are some demonstrators who are taking the risk of not only taking to the streets, but demanding that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, step down. Some demonstrators went so far as to call for the Communist Party and its leader to step down. Many were fed up with Xi, who in October secured a precedent-defying third term as the party's general secretary, and his zero COVID policy, which continues to disrupt everyday life, hurt livelihoods, and isolate the country, which is just demonstrably true. And one of the individuals who was recently met with brutality by authorities in China was BBC reporter Ed Lawrence, I believe. Yes, Ed Lawrence is his name. So we have a quick video of him getting arrested. Let's take a look at that.
Take a look at BBC reporter Ed Lawrence being taken into custody in Shanghai. Again, that is a journalist. Look what police are doing to him, taking him into custody. The BBC, the outlet he works for, says that Lawrence was kicked and handcuffed for hours.
And the BBC released a statement in response to that saying the BBC is extremely concerned about the treatment of our journalist, Ed Lawrence, who was arrested and handcuffed while covering the protests in Shanghai. He was held for several hours before being released. During his arrest, he was beaten and kicked by the police. This happened while he was working as an accredited journalist. So, look, we have brutality issues here in the United States in response to protesters. journalists get caught up in that violence all the time. So I don't want to pretend like that doesn't exist in the context of the United States. With that said, though, it doesn't help the Chinese authorities to meet journalists with that kind of brutality as these protests are going on.
Yeah, and so what's happening is also the cracking of the facade of the Chinese government, doing things that are horrible behind the scenes and then smiling to international audiences. What, us? Where the fire broke out is the Xinjiang province, where they have Chinese government is running concentration camps of Muslims. So that beating that you saw of the reporter is nothing compared to what's happening to Muslims in China as we speak. Over 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. Now, it's also true that we have our own issues here in America. For example, I talked about wrong systems. We have one of the worst systems in the world in money and politics. We allow open bribery of our politicians. That wrong system led to the wrong result of all of our politicians being completely corrupt and never serving our interests. And that is why, by the way, you have both Black Lives Matter protests and the Capitol riots. So both sides super frustrated. Why? Because both Republican and Democratic politicians never ever do what their voters want them to do, because we have institutionalized corruption here. So finally, protests, other than violent ones that get out of hand like happened on January 6th, are generally a wonderful thing, because it's a very rare outlet, whether you're in China, Iran, or America, to let the people in charge know at the end of the day, there is a wave of people here. And the one thing you cannot stop is a wave of humanity. So go out there and show them what you got. And I think the people doing it in China are incredibly brave.